Moscow had always believed itself untouchable. For years, the war was something distant, a grim television report, a spectacle that unfolded hundreds of kilometers away. But in the early hours of October 21st, 2025, that illusion was obliterated. What began as a quiet night turned into a scene out of apocalypse, the kind Russia hadn't witnessed since the dark days of World War II. The sky above the capital roared with explosions, streaks of light, and the unmistakable wail of air raid sirens. For millions of Muscovites, this was the moment the war came home. At 2:17 a.m., the first impacts were recorded near the Bryansk chemical plant and the Saransk mechanical factory, two vital arteries of Russia's defense industry. Minutes later, massive fireballs tore through the night, lighting up the horizon. Witnesses described a rumbling like an earthquake, followed by the metallic echoes of secondary explosions as storage tanks and ammunition silos ignited. Then came the unthinkable air raid alarms blaring across Moscow itself. Not Belgorod, not Kursk, but the very capital that had been portrayed as an impregnable fortress. According to Ukrainian intelligence HUR and confirmed by Western defense analysts, the operation was one of the most complex coordinated strikes ever launched by Kiev. It involved Storm Shadow Peklo and Flamingo precision-guided missiles supported by drone swarms designed to blind Russian radar. Each target was chosen for maximum strategic effect. The Bryansk plant, responsible for producing gunpowder and rocket fuel, was hit simultaneously with the Saransk factory, a key manufacturer of missile and artillery components. Hours later, a refinery in Makhachkala, 1,200 kilometers from the border, was also engulfed in flames. The results were catastrophic. Entire industrial zones, once considered the beating heart of Putin's war machine, were reduced to molten metal. Power lines fell, transformer stations exploded, and energy grids in Smolensk and Bryansk collapsed, plunging entire regions into darkness. Thousands of workers woke up to find their factories destroyed and their livelihoods gone. Across the country, panic spread through telegram channels and local networks as citizens realized this was no longer a special operation. It was total war, and it had reached their homes. In Moscow, the psychological shock was even deeper. Residents of luxury districts watched from balconies as bright streaks of air defense fire arced across the night sky. The so-called S-400 Shield, once touted as the most advanced in the world, struggled to intercept the incoming missiles. The sound of explosions echoed across the capital, shaking apartment windows and sending crowds rushing into metro stations for shelter. For the first time in modern Russian history, the myth of the capital's invincibility was shattered before millions of terrified eyes. By dawn, the smoke had not yet cleared. The skyline was tinted orange from fires still burning hundreds of kilometers away. Official channels released stiff, rehearsed statements claiming no significant damage. But the truth was already spreading faster than propaganda. Satellite images revealed vast craters where factories once stood. Independent analysts described the strikes as a strategic decapitation of Russia's military-industrial core. The war that once seemed distant was now inside Moscow's borders, and nothing, not even the Kremlin's iron narrative, could contain it. This was not just an attack. It was a turning point, the night when Russia's heart realized it could bleed. For 2 decades, Vladimir Putin's rule rested on a silent agreement, one that required no signatures, only obedience. Russians would not question the Kremlin's wars or policies, and in return the state would guarantee stability salaries and a sense of normal life. But on the night of October 21st, that unwritten pact burned with the factories of Bryansk and Saransk. What began as explosions in the distance became the symbolic destruction of a deal that had kept millions loyal. The 2 industrial cities hit by Ukraine's missiles were not just points on a map. They were living organisms, Monogorod's Soviet-style single-industry towns where the heartbeat of society pulsed from one massive factory. In Bryansk, the chemical plant supplied gunpowder, rocket propellant, and fuel for Grad and Smerch launchers. In Saransk, the mechanical plant forged critical missile parts and ammunition components. These facilities weren't merely workplaces, they were the backbone of regional life. Schools, hospitals, heating systems, and even small local businesses all depended on their output. When the plants went silent, entire cities went cold. By the morning of October 22nd, the consequences were undeniable. Independent labor analysts estimated that 70 to 85,000 people had lost their livelihoods overnight. Truck drivers, welders, maintenance crews, and the shop owners who served them were all trapped in the same downward spiral. Telegram channels filled with desperate messages. "Our factory is gone. We have no money now. Who will feed us?" These were not political dissidents or opposition voices, they were the workers who once kept the war machine alive. For years, Putin's power base had relied on these silent, loyal citizens. They were not marching for democracy or shouting in the streets. They worked, they obeyed, and in return the state kept the lights on. But as flames engulfed the industrial core of Russia, that promise disintegrated. The same people who manufactured weapons for the front lines were now the victims of the war they were told would never touch them. For the first time, the myth of stability cracked open. Economically, the blow was devastating. Regional employment reports leaked through Russian networks painted a picture of collapsed tens of thousands, without income logistics routes disrupted and power shortages spreading. Even Moscow's Ministry of Industry and Trade quietly admitted that the loss of Bryansk and Saransk could not be compensated in the short term. The Kremlin's propaganda machine attempted to spin the disaster as temporary production interruptions, but local footage told a different story. Cratered buildings, scorched machinery and chemical smoke, rising like black pillars against the morning sky. Strategically, the strikes were more than military victories. They pierced the psychological armor of a nation raised on the illusion of safety. In one night, Ukraine had forced millions of Russians to confront a truth their government could no longer hide: the war had consequences inside Russia itself. Across the country, fear began to shift into anger. This was not rebellion yet, but it was something far more dangerous: the quiet realization that the Kremlin could no longer protect its own. In kitchens, on factory ruins, and across frozen apartment blocks, ordinary Russians began asking questions once considered unthinkable. If the state cannot defend our jobs, our homes, or our future, what exactly is it defending? And as those questions spread, the foundations of Putin's empire began to tremble. To understand how Ukraine pierced what Moscow once called the impenetrable shield, we must look closely at the operation that unfolded across the night of October 21st. This was no random missile barrage. It was a meticulously coordinated strike, part intelligence, part technology, part psychological warfare, executed with surgical precision. According to Ukraine's Defense Intelligence (HUR) and Western military observers, the attack involved a synchronized blend of unmanned aerial vehicles, precision-guided missiles, and decoy tactics designed to overwhelm Russian defenses at multiple layers. Hours before the first explosion, radar operators near Bryansk began detecting strange activity, hundreds of low-flying drones appearing simultaneously on their screens. Some were armed kamikaze drones, others were simple decoys worth less than $500 each. Their purpose was not to destroy, but to confuse. Within minutes, Russia's expensive Panzer and S-400 air defense systems began firing interceptors worth hundreds of thousands of dollars at disposable targets. The sky became a chaotic ballet of flares and explosions, blinding sensors and draining ammunition reserves. While the Russian defenses were busy chasing phantoms, the real strike wave was already approaching. Flying at treetop level, Storm Shadow cruise missiles jointly developed by Britain and France crossed the border at near supersonic speed. These stealth weapons used infrared imaging guidance, allowing them to identify targets without relying on GPS signals, which made them immune to Russia's jamming attempts. Moments later, Ukrainian-built Peklo and Flamingo missiles followed, delivering the final blows. The Bryansk chemical plant erupted in an explosion so vast it was captured by satellites orbiting over Europe. Simultaneously, a second strike group targeted the Saransk mechanical plant nearly 700 kilometers from Ukraine's border. The precision and reach of this attack shocked analysts worldwide. Never before had Russia's interior industrial zone been hit with such accuracy. The facility, a crucial producer of missile components and artillery shells, was reduced to rubble within seconds. Even more astonishing was the attack on Dagnotech refinery in Makhachkala, over 1,000 kilometers away, the energy artery that fueled Russia's Caspian Sea Fleet. By striking there, Ukraine proved that no region, no matter how distant, was beyond reach. According to satellite data and NATO reconnaissance, at least 37 missiles and more than 200 drones were used in total. Ukrainian military sources later revealed that the operation had been months in planning. Intelligence agents mapped every radar position, fuel depot and anti-air battery across western Russia. The strikes were timed with precision, each wave creating a window of vulnerability for the next. When the dust settled, Russian authorities claimed to have shot down 6 drones and reported no significant damage. But locals knew better. Videos on Telegram showed entire industrial zones burning, explosions reflecting on the night clouds like lightning. The sound of air defense fire echoed as far as Moscow's suburbs, where residents took shelter in metro stations, realizing that their city, the symbol of safety, was now part of the battlefield. This was not merely a tactical success. It was a psychological breakthrough. For the first time since World War II, Moscow had heard the cry of sirens and the rumble of explosions inside its own territory. The illusion of distance, that comforting belief that war belonged to others, collapsed in one night. The operation proved that Ukraine's reach was longer, its intelligence deeper, and its strategy far more sophisticated than the Kremlin had ever admitted. And as the fires in Bryansk and Saransk burned into dawn, one truth became undeniable: the shield of Russia was broken and the war had entered its core. In the early hours after the strikes, military analysts across Europe began calling it a technological checkmate. What Ukraine had achieved was not simply a successful bombing run. It was a total dismantling of Russia's myth of invincibility. The S-400 air defense system, once marketed as the crown jewel of Moscow's military pride, had failed to stop a coordinated wave of Western and Ukrainian weapons. The very shield that was supposed to guard the nation's heart had been ripped apart by a new kind of warfare, one built on intelligence, adaptability, and precision. The brilliance of Ukraine's plan lay in its multi-layered strategy. The first layer was deception, thousands of low-cost UAVs flooding Russian radar screens, forcing operators to waste missiles worth millions on decoys. The second layer was suppression, swarms of kamikaze drones targeting radar sites, communication hubs, and early warning systems. The third layer, the killing blow, came from Storm Shadow and Peklo cruise missiles that slipped silently through the chaos, flying at tree level and striking within meters of their assigned coordinates. This blend of Western stealth technology and Ukrainian ingenuity shattered decades of Russian air defense doctrine. The Bryansk chemical plant, once buried under reinforced concrete and designed to withstand conventional bombing, was hit directly through its underground storage chambers. Engineers later confirmed that the missile penetrated the structure before detonating, ensuring the destruction of its critical rocket fuel synthesis units. In Saransk, the explosion was equally devastating. The factory's CNC precision machines, essential for missile gyroscopes, and targeting systems were obliterated beyond repair. Analysts compared the impact to cutting off the hands of Russia's military industry. What made the assault so devastating was its reach. These targets were not located near the border, but deep inside Russia's interior, 600 to 1,200 kilometers away. For Moscow's generals, it was an unthinkable scenario. The heartland itself turned vulnerable. The S-400 Panzer and Tor M2 systems that had been positioned to defend critical infrastructure failed to intercept the low-flying radar-evading missiles. The attack revealed fatal weaknesses: outdated radar algorithms, limited reaction time, and poor coordination among command centers. This strike also introduced the world to Ukraine's new generation of long-range weapons. The Peklo and Flamingo missiles, evolved from the famous Neptune that sank the Moskva cruiser, had now proven capable of striking static ground targets with pinpoint precision. Western observers noted that this signaled a new phase of warfare. Ukraine was no longer reacting, it was dictating the tempo. The Russian army, once the hunter, had become the hunted within its own territory. The symbolic weight of the event was immense. For years, Kremlin propaganda had assured citizens that the S-400 Triumph shield could intercept any threat. It was marketed as Russia's ultimate defense, capable of downing stealth aircraft and hypersonic missiles. On October 21st, that illusion collapsed before a global audience. The most expensive and heavily guarded defense network in the world had been rendered useless by a handful of missiles and drones, costing a fraction of the price. From London to Warsaw, analysts described it as the night modern warfare changed. The traditional balance between cost and destruction had been overturned, and Russia, once a symbol of military endurance, stood exposed. For the Kremlin, this was more than humiliation. It was the loss of deterrence, the realization that even Moscow's skies could be breached at will. Ukraine had not only struck deep into Russian soil, it had rewritten the rules of the war. The empire that once claimed to be untouchable now stood naked before the world. When dawn broke over the smoldering remains of Bryansk and Saransk, a deeper reality emerged. Russia's industrial heart had suffered wounds that could not be healed. The damage was not temporary, not something a few engineers or propaganda broadcasts could conceal. It was systemic, irreversible, and devastating to the very foundation of Moscow's war machine. The Bryansk chemical plant, once responsible for producing the gunpowder and solid rocket fuel that powered Russia's artillery, was gone. Its specialized reactors, alloyed synthesis chambers, and precision control units, all sourced from Western technology, before sanctions had been obliterated. These machines cannot simply be replaced. They require years of design, specialized metallurgy, and exact calibration. Every destroyed unit represents not just a loss of equipment, but the loss of expertise accumulated over decades. Without them, the production of Grad and Smerch rockets grinds to a halt. The Saransk mechanical plant suffered a similar fate. The factory's underground workshops, filled with CNC machines used to craft missile gyroscopes and drone guidance systems, were reduced to ruins. Western analysts estimate that rebuilding a single production line of this scale could take 3 to 5 years, even under peaceful conditions. But Russia is not at peace, it is isolated. Under heavy sanctions, it cannot legally import high-precision tools from Europe, Japan, or South Korea. Even Chinese replacements, often presented as an alternative, fall short in both precision and durability. A system requiring tolerances of 1/10,000th of a centimeter cannot function with substandard substitutes. This means one thing: Russia's military-industrial complex has suffered a permanent amputation. The flow of ammunition, missile parts, and artillery fuel that sustained frontline operations has been severed. Even if new factories are built, they will face the same risk of destruction. As one Western defense official noted, "You cannot rebuild what the enemy can strike again tomorrow." The consequences go beyond production numbers. The destruction of these factories strikes at the psychological and economic stability of Putin's regime. These were not faceless industrial facilities. They were symbols of national strength and sources of livelihood for entire regions. Tens of thousands of workers who once produced the weapons of war now stand unemployed, staring at the ruins that once defined their identity. The loss of these jobs threatens to trigger regional unrest in areas once loyal to the Kremlin. The Kremlin's response so far has been denial and retaliation. Instead of addressing the industrial collapse, Russia struck back by attacking Ukrainian civilian energy infrastructure, launching waves of Geran-2 drones and Iskander missiles against power stations in Kyiv and Kharkiv. But such actions only expose the regime's desperation. Destroying civilian grids cannot rebuild the factories in Bryansk or Saransk. It cannot restore lost machines or feed jobless families. The revenge strikes were not a show of strength, but a confession of weakness, a reminder that Moscow no longer has equivalent targets to hit. Strategically, the loss is catastrophic. Without the capacity to produce missile components and propellants domestically, Russia's army becomes dependent on dwindling stockpiles and unreliable imports. The once boasted vision of self-sufficient war production has collapsed under the weight of modern precision warfare. Each destroyed facility is a blow not just to the economy, but to the myth of a self-reliant superpower. As analysts from Reuters and DW noted, this is not just an economic downturn, it is industrial paralysis. The machine that powered the war has seized up, and no amount of propaganda can restart it. The night of October 21st will be remembered as the moment when Russia's war effort shifted from advance to decay, from dominance to desperation. The battlefield had moved beyond the trenches, it had entered the factories, the economy, and the very soul of the Russian state. As smoke still drifted above Bryansk and Saransk, another kind of explosion was unfolding, one inside the minds of the Russian people. For the first time in decades, both the elite in Moscow and the workers in the provinces felt the same thing: fear. The fear that the state could no longer protect them, their jobs, or their illusion of security. The war that had once been distant now existed in the skies above their own homes. In Moscow, panic spread quickly. The so-called untouchables, government officials, media executives, and oligarchs watched as their air defenses failed in real time. Sirens wailed across luxury districts once considered safe, and the light of air defense fire reflected off the glass towers of the capital. Metro stations turned into makeshift bomb shelters. The myth of invulnerability that the Kremlin had nurtured for years disintegrated in a single night. For the privileged class, October 21st was the end of the illusion that Putin's power could protect them from the chaos he unleashed. Meanwhile, in Bryansk and Saransk, anger began to simmer among the people who had been the backbone of Putin's regime. These were not dissidents or protesters. They were loyal, hardworking citizens who had believed the promises of stability and security. Now they stood jobless, hungry, and betrayed. Local officials tried to calm the outrage by claiming no damage, but videos on Telegram told the truth. Entire districts blackened, factories gone, lives destroyed. Russian social media became a battlefield of its own. Messages leaked from workers' chat groups captured a raw despair that propaganda could not erase. Our factory is gone. The war took everything, even our food. Winter is coming and we have no heating. These voices, once silent, now echoed through the digital corridors of a crumbling empire. What began as confusion turned into quiet rage, a feeling more dangerous to any regime than open revolt. For Vladimir Putin, the situation was now an unsolvable equation. Every move came with a cost he could no longer afford. If he admitted the extent of the destruction, his image of control would collapse. If he lied, the truth from the ground would expose him. For the first time in his rule, the Kremlin faced a domestic crisis it could not suppress by censorship or force. The war had consumed its own home front. The elite realized that the capital was no longer untouchable. The working class realized that loyalty no longer guaranteed survival. Between them stretched a widening gulf of distrust. The once powerful vertical of power, that rigid chain of control running from the Kremlin to the smallest provincial office, had begun to fracture. October 21, 2025 marked not only the collapse of factories and refineries, but the beginning of Russia's internal disintegration. What Ukraine achieved in that single night went beyond military success. It pierced the psychological heart of a nation. The Kremlin could rebuild propaganda, but it could not rebuild trust. For the first time in generations, Russians looked at their leaders and saw weakness and perhaps an ending. This was not the prelude to collapse. It was collapse itself, unfolding in real time, lit by the fires of Bryansk and echoed in the silence of Moscow's trembling dawn. The events of October 21st to 22nd were more than headlines or battlefield updates. They marked a transformation, the moment when Ukraine's precision warfare merged the front lines with Russia's heartland. The strikes on Bryansk, Saransk and Makhachkala didn't just cripple weapons production. They tore apart the illusion that Moscow could wage war without consequence. For decades, the Russian regime relied on fear and stability, fear to silence dissent, and stability to buy loyalty. But now both have vanished. The once loyal workers who forged the weapons of war stand jobless and desperate. The elites who dined under crystal chandeliers now hear the thunder of air defense missiles outside their windows. The empire that boasted of power is facing its own reflection, a reflection cracked and burning. Across the world, analysts call this the Bryansk moment, the turning point when Russia's war turned inward. From that night onward, the Kremlin was no longer waging war on Ukraine alone. It was fighting a new battle against time, against truth, and against its own people's awakening. As the smoke clears, one question remains. Can a regime built on control survive when its own people have seen the truth? If this story gave you a new perspective, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts below, and subscribe to the channel for more in-depth reports on global power shifts and military realities. Because the war no longer belongs only to the front, it belongs to history unfolding before our eyes.